Constantinople open the city gates for the Crusaders. They come into the city, and Alexis Angelus is then placed on the throne. Now, unfortunately, he had a very unpopular, and takes the name as Alexis IV. It was a very unpopular reign. What he did was, in order to pay off the Crusaders, he didn't have enough money in the treasury, so he began to exhume the bodies of old emperors and take off their jewels and their robes and all the gold that was associated with their burial. He actually took sacred objects and chalices and whatnot and gave them to the Crusaders in for payment, in exchange for payment. So he became very, very unpopular. He was eventually overthrown by one of his trusted lieutenants, who took the name Alexis V. So a lot of Alexis going on at this time of the Fourth Crusade. So Alexis V now is on the throne. He overthrew Alexis Angelus, Alexis IV, and actually has him killed in prison. So the Crusaders now understand that things are out of control. They haven't gotten paid. They're a little upset. So they decide that they're going to attack the city again. So they attack the city. They march in. They're able to get into the city, and then they sack the city for several days. They commit all kinds of horrendous crimes: sacrilege, murder, rape. Innocent III wrote a letter to the leader of the crusade, a man by the name of Boniface of Montferrand, and after he heard about the sack, and he says this. He wrote this: "You rashly violated the purity of your vows, and turning your arms not against the Saracens, but against Christians, you applied yourselves not to the recovery of Jerusalem, but to seize Constantinople, preferring earthly to heavenly riches. These soldiers of Christ, who should have turned their swords against the infidel, have steeped them in Christian blood. The Latins have given example only of perversity and works of darkness. No wonder the Greeks call them dogs." Now the Greeks are obviously very upset at the sack of Constantinople at the time. And they are still upset at the sack of Constantinople today. John Paul II, just to give you an example of how this event still resonates among the Greeks and the Eastern Orthodox Church. When John Paul II visited Athens in 2001, he was on his Popemobile and he was driving to a particular location, to a meeting. Along the route were people lined up who were protesting. Many were actually welcoming him, but many were protesting his arrival. And there was a whole series of Greek Orthodox monks that were specifically protesting his arrival, and they held signs. They had placards in their hands. And on those placards, they had written the year 1204, when the city of Constantinople had been sacked. So they still are upset at this day over the sack. It's almost unimaginable for us to think why they would still be upset. And one of the reasons why is that people from the East see history much differently than we do. They see history as what happened in the past, and the effects of that are as present today as when it first happened. So if you slighted somebody 1,000 years ago, that's still a slight to them today. Whereas for us, in Western mind, history is much more linear. What happens in the past happens in the past. It's no big deal, right? I mean, none of us would ever imagine or even contemplate meeting the plane of the Prime Minister of Great Britain, holding up signs when he came to visit the United States, holding up signs that say 1814, which is when the British burned Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812. We would never do that. We would never even presume to do that. But again, we think of history much differently than people in the East. Now, one historian has, I think, accurately described the sacking of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade as an event that can be explained but not justified, which is true. I mean, it is. We do have to acknowledge that these Western knights did go into the city and they did commit sacrilege and criminal acts. But again, the church is not responsible for that. So Innocent III knew that they were doing this. He wrote letters to them threatening excommunication, told them what they did was wrong. It was not something ordered or directed by the church. Now, after the Fourth Crusade, we have the Fifth Crusade, which was another crusade preached by Innocent III. The Fourth Crusade had gone horribly wrong. He wanted to right that wrong and launch a new crusade. So he calls this crusade, the plans for it were discussed at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and he designed this crusade to be a crusade that was completely administered and centrally managed by the church. He placed at the head of this crusade Cardinal Pelagius, who was to be the leader of the crusade. The leader was not going to be a secular military ruler, but a representative of the church. Now, unfortunately, Innocent III dies in 1216 before this crusade actually launches, and so he was never able to see it to completion. And he's succeeded by Pope Honorius III. Now, the Crusaders go to Egypt this time in order to take command and control of Egypt in the hopes that by securing Egypt militarily, that would give them a good base of operations to then launch an effective strike into Jerusalem. So they don't go directly to Jerusalem, they're going now to Egypt. They go to Egypt, they besiege the city of Damietta. The Muslim ruler in Egypt at the time is Al-Kamil. He actually gives them an offer. He offers them a treaty. And the stipulations of his treaty was that he would hand them back the entire kingdom of Jerusalem. Basically all the conquest of Saladin he would give back to the Crusaders if the Crusaders left and walked away from their siege of Daimeto. The Cardinal Pelagius said no to this offer. It was a very foolish move on his part. This was a great deal, which he turned down. Now, during the middle of this crusade, an interesting figure walks into the Crusader camp and comes to the Crusader camp on a special mission. And his special mission is to convert the Sultan, to convert Al-Kamil. And it's the great Saint Francis. Saint Francis comes to Egypt, comes to the Crusader camp, goes through the Muslim lines, is brought into Al-Kamil's presence, and preaches the gospel to him, tries to convert him to the Christian faith. Al-Kamil listens to him, but then refuses to convert, but asks to St. Francis to pray for him and says, "Remember me in your prayers, and may God, by your intercession, reveal to me which belief is more pleasing to him." So St. Francis believed that he was open to conversion, and perhaps there was that kernel of conversion there, but it was never brought to realization. The Crusaders are able to conquer the city of Daimeto. They leave Daimeto, then march to Cairo to try to take over that city. Unfortunately, while they're marching out in the open, they're encircled by a Turkish army, a Muslim army rather, and destroyed. And so the crusade falls apart, and they end up leaving Egypt, having basically nothing. So the Fourth Crusade failed, the Fifth Crusade failed, and when we come back from our next, and so these crusades have now really caused a series of problems for the church. They're very effective in the beginning of the First Crusade. The Third Crusade was partially successful, but now we've had a series of failures, unfortunately. When we go into our next session, we'll talk about a very important man in England, St. Thomas Becket, the creation of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and we'll also talk about the medieval inquisitors.
So, there's your quick overview of the first 5 crusades, and as he mentioned, there were some successes in the first one and a little bit in the third, but there was also a lot of failures. So, interesting, good information in there. So we've got questions. We can briefly go through those, and let's see. Okay, so I think we'll probably just be able to cover about 6 questions. We're, as always, running short on time, but that's okay. So let me group you together, and so if you all want to do question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4, question 5, and then, I know you have to go, so I'll do question 6. Okay. And so we'll just read through those, and the responses, the answers begin on page 145, so just briefly read through your question, kind of discuss your thoughts for 2 or 3 minutes, and then read through what the response answer is, and then we can discuss those pretty quickly here. So if you want to go ahead and get together, we can do that now. Of course, we're getting short on time, so if you want to start going over the questions, we can start with question number 1. If you all want to just give us maybe your thoughts on that. So many modern myths surround the Crusades, including the massacre of Jerusalem, where it's alleged that the Crusaders massacred all the inhabitants of the city upon its liberation. The story goes that so much blood was spilled, the Crusaders waded through it up to their knees. What is the true story of the liberation of Jerusalem?
There was a vision given by one of the bishops that had died. If they walked barefoot around the city, they would be able to win, and that's what they did. It didn't really, there was bloodshed, but it didn't end where it was always.
Yeah, it was a little bit exaggerated. And yeah, that's kind of stuck throughout history, but that's not what the truth of the matter was. True. So, okay, good. On question number 2, one historian has remarked, the Second Crusade was born by papal pronouncement, but it drew breath from the words of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Who was Saint Bernard, and what role did he play in the Second Crusade?
Saint Bernard was a Cistercian that was sent to Clairvaux, and he started out with 12 monks and ended up with about 700 when he died. He provided crosses for the Crusaders, cloth crosses. He was preached the crusade to the Western Europe, and his preaching motivated men to join, so much so that he had to tear from his alb cloth for the more crosses.
Yep. He was a very holy man.
Yep.
So, good. All right. Question number 3. Although hopes were high, the Second Crusade was not as successful as the first. What happened on this crusade? Who were the main participants, and why did it fail?
The main participants were the Holy Roman Emperor and King of the Germans and Louis VII of France. They didn't coordinate any plan that they had. Conrad led his army through the difficult terrain. He was ambushed, suffered devastating defeat. Louis VII took the coastal road but was constantly harassed. The Byzantines were going to provide naval transports, but they didn't arrive on time. It was just a mess. So they had to leave most of their troops behind. They ended up going to Damascus. They marched to Damascus instead of Edessa. And this is where they wanted to surround the city, but they didn't have enough troops, and all the Muslims were getting in from the east side. So, and they didn't have reinforcements, they were indefensible, they had no food, water, and they had abandoned the siege, so they picked up and went home.
Pretty hard to have a siege when you can only cover one side of the city.
Right.
Not going to be a very effective mission, and it wasn't. So, great. Thank you. All right. And so, question number 4. The recent movie, Kingdom of Heaven, purports to tell the story of the Kingdom of Jerusalem right before the Third Crusade. Have you seen the movie, and do you have any thoughts on it? And are the real historical events portrayed accurately in the movie? Is that you all? Okay.
Before the Third Crusade.
Yeah. Have you seen that movie?
No, I have not, but
Okay.
that was good.
Oh.
Yeah, it's not worth
Did you see it,
seeing.
Janie?
I
Okay.
saw it.
So,
Yeah.
since you haven't seen it, based on what he said,
It doesn't
It's
yeah,
not accurate.
not an accurate portrayal. Yeah, I remember seeing it a long time ago, and I mean it's got good action, but it doesn't necessarily make it a proper historical film. So, yeah. Okay, so let's move on to question number 5. The Third Crusade is probably the most well-known crusade. It is a dramatic story with larger-than-life characters. Who were the main actors in this great story? What happened during this crusade, and was it successful?
So the 3 kings were Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor. His fate was he drowned, and so all of his troops went home. What he didn't mention there in here is France and England had been fighting when Jerusalem fell.
Yeah.
So the Pope decreed a 7-year truce so that they could bring soldiers together to go fight. So even though they were on the same side in the crusade, they had just been battling each other. So France and England weren't getting along, So that was Richard I of England and Philip II of France. They won one battle at Acre, and then Philip went home and started causing trouble, and then Richard's brother John was causing more trouble in England, and so they could never take Jerusalem. He made the treaty so that they could at least go into the Holy Land for 3 years,
Right.
and then Richard went home.
So there was one component of it that was successful, but yeah, it was kind of a mixed bag. So yeah, all right. Well, unfortunately, we're already several minutes over, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. There are 3 more questions, which you've all got your books. I would encourage you to read through because it's got more information about the Fourth Crusade and Pope Innocent. So more good information in there. And again, we will meet next week, same time, probably the same place. If not, there'll be a note on the door. But the gathering space is supposed to open pretty soon. I just don't know when it'll be. So thanks again for showing up. Any other questions, come see me. And otherwise, we will plan on seeing you next week. And I'll let you know about the change in schedule for 2 weeks from now. So,
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.